Please welcome Pere Monclus.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today. We are very excited in this second event of FutureNet. The first one was last year. And what we see is that since last year, I think the interest, the topics, the attendance, it's growing, and we are seeing the excitement. And it's great to see many faces here, because basically, as you have seen, networking is in the middle of a big transition. And we have kind of the old paradigm of networking, all the experts, all the expertise that has been developed over the years that somehow now is being transformed into this new world. And we have all the newcomers, new startups, new people, new energy coming with different type of understanding of what's going on in the industry. So it's great to see all of you here and how we can have this collaborative environment and have great discussions together. A little bit as a background, I'm now driving basically the CTO of NSBU in VMware, kind of where the NSX group is. And I just wanted to thank the effort that Bruce Davey has been doing over the years in that group, and especially in this conference. Last year, Bruce was the person behind a lot of the organization, a lot of the topics. He's been here this year, and he's been driving a lot of the discussions and interest on this conference too. So we'll have him tomorrow, and he'll have the opportunity to explain how he has seen the transition from last year to this year, and bring his perspective into the topic. Last year, I had the privilege to attend being part of a small company, PlumGrid, and I enjoyed the conference a lot for what we were saying, that somehow a lot of conferences that have appeared over the years have evolved. I mean, if you think there's from standard bodies to conferences to different forums of innovation to new open source projects, but somehow what we felt was that there was something missing, something that would not be specific to a project or specific to open source community or specific to a set of vendors. And what we wanted to create is this forum of discussion and collaboration. So the thing that you have to take home today is that this is not just about the topics that we are going to discuss, that we are going to see, and the great speakers that we have lined up, but it's more about how to connect between all of us, how to create this forum that we can cross boundaries, organizations, people's communities, and exchange knowledge. And as you see, networking now is becoming very broad, going from hardware to software to cloud. So the whole point of this conference is to create this group of people that we are going to come here stronger as a community, exchange ideas, exchange maybe works, projects, and make networking a little bit more cohesive and figure out where we want to take it. The other thing, I wanted to welcome the people online. This year, the difference is that most of these sessions are going to be recorded, so be careful with what you say. And some of them are being streamed online. So welcome to everybody through the internet, and happy to have you here too. Okay, the conference has increased a lot. We are keeping it kind of cozy in a way that we can have this spirit of collaboration, but at the same time, next time, suggest people that you think that would be relevant to have in the discussions. So we are interested to make it more and more relevant. Moving to the next. So basically, why do we have this feeling that we need to have these innovation forums? And are we lost? Do we have to find our way home? And what's going on? And what we see is that the emergence of a lot of trends and interest and groups and so on, right? One would be on the part of new technologies. We see that we went from, oh, everything is about switches and routers, to everything is about controllers, to everything is about network virtualization, everything is about intent, everything is about analytics. So this feels a little bit confusing in the sense that we went from understanding networking as an end-to-end fundamental element of the infrastructure to now thinking a lot of technology components. Is this the way to think it, or should we think it in a different way? The other, we are seeing a lot of markets that are crystallizing, like, I don't know, network virtualization in data center, SD-WAN, analytics, some spaces that are gaining enough critical mass to become a business by itself, should we look at it from the business side point of view. And then, of course, we are going to talk a little bit about the forums, the discussions, the interoperability aspect, the standard bodies, what's the role of all this in this transformation. So, are we lost? I mean, with all this noise, all the reference falling, is it that we are a little bit confused, or something is changing? And what is it changing? So here the thinking was, what if what's happening is that we are changing the reference point? I mean, if you think until now, we were living in siloed worlds. Infrastructure was about compute, storage, networking, and we would have experts in compute, experts in storage, experts in networking, and something has changed. Now it's not about networking anymore, it's about infrastructure. It's how do we start thinking to provide kind of a cohesive, fundamental elements where something can run on top of that. And if you think this, you could argue that has come in many directions or for many reasons. One could be because of the advent of cloud. I mean, when you have the ability to create infrastructure in a way that you request it and it appears, do the silos make sense? When you think in terms of your operations and agility that you need in your enterprises in terms of digital transformation or deploying new projects or things like that, does it make sense to have it siloed? So one of the fundamental shifts that we are seeing is that how do we understand networking as one of the elements that has to blend with all the rest of the infrastructure? And we are going to see a lot of talks on this direction in the sense of when that happens, how do you configure? Do you still configure? Do you express your intentions? Do you have a different way to understand with languages? So we'll talk a little bit about that. The other aspect that is probably a consequence of that is simplification. We cannot keep maintaining complex infrastructure, siloed, and so on, because it goes against agility. So the simplification aspect is one of the elements that forces us to think in a different way. And of course, when you start thinking like that, then is, well, what about automation? What about self-provisioning? What about security? What about elasticity? And it's these notions of saying that networking is not about connecting machines anymore. Networking is not about how to connect devices anymore, but rather essentially is how to enable communications. And now the question is, what is communications? Is it between humans? Is it between devices? Is it between swarms of devices? And you start thinking that within kind of communication theory, you always had like a sender, a receiver, a message, a channel, an encoding. And this is nothing to do with technology. This even Noam Chomsky in the 50s was defining the principles of communications and the dimensions of communications. So now we translate it to the world where we are right now. And what's happening is that the use that we do of infrastructure is changing. Now we have like many more devices, many more cell phones, many more applications, things that before were not that common. And then you have the need to scale applications. So within that, the question is, what is networking? Is it connectivity? Is it security? Is it elasticity? Is it all of them? So that's one of the aspects of changing the frame of reference and focusing not from a networking point of view, but from an infrastructure overall. And then if we have changed the frame of reference, so what's at the center? So we are in this app explosion. So it's not about us. I mean, we are discussing infrastructure here, networking here. It's not necessarily about creating the most agile infrastructure of the world or the most solid or the most secure. It's about how to enable something that has to extract value, that has to deliver new features, new capabilities, that has to solve new problems. And this is going to be the applications that sit on top of that. So having said that, we are still discussing about infrastructure and networking. So let's not get excited. We don't want to like deviate the topics and focus on some of the trends and discussions that are happening in the application world. But essentially it's bringing this point of view of saying, when we are going to discuss about the different topics from a networking point of view, hardware, configuration, intent, automation, we always have to think that the frame of reference has changed, and now we have to start thinking, how are applications developed? Are they developed in the cloud? Are they developed with containers, with Kubernetes, with serverless, you name it? And we have to figure out how do we attach and how do we connect to those frameworks. So within here is what we are discussing about how do we combine these multiple trends. The first one, as we were discussing, is the technology one. And this is something that I think is dear to all of us, and that it's kind of tempting to fall and discuss all these elements. We started in the past with like understanding how the transition between ASICs and programmable ASICs, or networking ASICs and merchant silicon and things like that, or network processors many years ago. And that led to a revolution in the space of networking. Now, as we started going up the stack, we realized that, well, it was not only about that, it was about the automation, it was about the configuration of the network end-to-end. And we started having the notion of from fabric controllers, or the other aspect going around the network with network virtualization, creating overlays. And that was trying to fulfill this notion of saying, we have to do a better job automating and configuring the whole story end-to-end. But somehow these two elements, the overlay, the underlay, the network virtualization layer, the physical layer, have not completely merged yet. And this is one of the topics that we want to explore in great detail today about how do we start going towards models, intent, analytics. How do we think it not in terms of overlays and underlays, but how do we think it in terms of networking, end-to-end? At the end of the day, the problem is how to connect things. And knowing that networking end-to-end may mean many, many things. We may be in an environment where you have a data center that you own. We may be in an environment that you have a data center and a public cloud. We may be in an environment that you don't have private data center. You may have many public clouds. So now what does it mean to define this networking end-to-end with intent? Are we controlling switches and network overlays? Or are we controlling cloud networks? Or are we controlling VPNs? And this is going to be one of the topics that we are going to spend quite a bit of time. Of course, on top of that, as these systems become more increasingly complex, because now you have many vendors, many players, many clouds, many technologies, how do we keep operating all these things? And a lot of times we get excited on, I can connect my networking system to this automation framework and look what can I provision. And we tend to think about the day one operations. How do I provision things, about the life cycle of applications, VMs, service containers, and so on. But what about when things break? And I think this is one of the topics that we have to put a lot of thinking and focus on providing more capabilities, more standard mechanism of exporting telemetry, more ways of reacting to telemetry, more ways to find how to place workloads and so on. So that's the aspect that we have to stop thinking about networking as plumbing, and we have to start thinking how the networking components play together to provide a proper solution, not only to the applications using the network, but even to the practitioners that have to support and maintain those networks and those security policies and so on. So that's going to be one of the elements that we are going to cover in depth. Then you go to the other opposite side, the drivers. At the end of the day, is what you are saying is about applications. And today you have that a lot of applications are embedded deep in the enterprise in frameworks like WebSphere, WebLogic, and developing Java, monolithic applications, and so on. And now you have completely the opposite, like translating it into containers, distributed frameworks, working across the cloud, private and public enterprises, and so on. Now, if we go completely to the top, it's like, who cares about networking? We should start realizing that it's not about networking, but rather how those new frameworks are going to deploy and manage the lifecycle of applications and how they are going to provide what we were discussing before, automation, security, elasticity, and those are new concepts in the way we understand them. Today, we tend to think in terms of load balancers, firewalls, switches, routers, but those frameworks are going to force us in terms of the definition of what you want in terms of scalability, security, placement. So now we have to figure out what do we have to do. Do we have to create management layers and abstractions that we connect the desired state to the existing technologies that we have? Or do we have to start thinking in terms of how our network elements are fully distributed and we just like configure or enable certain features? The other topic is going to be, in the past when we were discussing networking routing protocols, there was always the assumption that you would have multiple people or multiple companies or multiple service providers that would have to reach certain agreements in terms of how to exchange routes, how to exchange services, QoS levels, and things like that. And there was a way to do it through standard mechanisms. Now we're in a world that we say, I have my SDN layer is better than your SDN layer. But the question is, well, when we create a chain of services, do I allow certain offloads or a specific network function to be placed into the data plane of a different vendor? So maybe there's a new dimension of interoperability, because now it's not anymore just the notion of exchanging where your addresses are, or what pools, or what subnets, or what traffic would be allowed, or what priorities. But now we start to think, well, with the advent of new hardware capabilities, can we enable other vendors, other elements, other technologies to make use of these capabilities without having to kind of necessarily own that element? And if you think this is very dear to the thinking of hardware and software separation, because when you have like a server, a PC, a hypervisor, you name it, you always have a set of resources that run in hardware that are going to be utilized by software. Now the question is, software by one vendor creating a vertically integrated solution, or software by many vendors that they can use the offloads and the capabilities? And you see that there's a lot of push and interest on the NFB community on those topics. And I don't think we have provided yet a solid answer to solve all these problems because of the complexity, security issues, and so on. But it's another topic that may require some attention. And going back to what we were saying before, I mean, if you put these technology elements with the drivers on top of that, what happens is that a lot of interest happens within our companies, startups, investors, researchers, where we are creating all these things. But sometimes they come and go. Now the question is, why? Are we just like focusing on the latest and greatest technology, or we are trying to figure out how to crystallize those technologies, those needs into certain markets? And the other thing that we have to realize as a community is this, that we have to have outlets of innovation and desires from an application or integration point of view into commercially viable outlets. And this is where, or we start thinking in terms of how to create ecosystems where we can play components in a better way, or we start thinking on how to package end-to-end solutions, which is kind of the default aspect. So another topic that I'm very interested to exchange ideas with all of you between the breaks or between the presentations is this, is now we are somehow starting to label those markets. So is this cloud networking? Is this data center network virtualization? Is it SD-WAN? Is it NFV? But it seems that we are not even talking between ourselves. Like we are discussing certain things in NFV that may or may not be relevant with data center network virtualization, that may not be relevant with how we understand networking in the cloud. And what's the answer? Is it about standardizing something, which most likely is going to be very hard, or is it about creating interoperability layers or understanding of identities and metadata and things that can cross from one segment to the next? But if you think that the way we are thinking right now is a little bit awkward, because it's like saying, oh, I have edge routers, I have campus switches, I have data center switches, and all of them are valid markets. But at the end of the day, they were all communicating because there was IP, there were routing protocols. There was a way to have a virtual machine in a data center campus communicating with a remote office running a laptop and all the steps in between. So how are we going to achieve similar end-to-end capabilities in these spaces when things are going to shift in terms of understanding strong identity, understanding elasticity, understanding placement? And we have to have a way to exchange that information in these new frameworks. Which brings us to the right side of the slide, the standard bodies or the interoperability. What we are seeing is that kind of a change in that space too. We had the standard bodies, the traditional ones, IETF, IEEE, all the ones that we've been and we've seen and grown in the industry over the years. And suddenly something is changing. I mean, there was a new set of think tanks or research groups that they tried to bring innovation because they had to complain. And they had to complain, and I was at Cisco at that time in an advanced development team, and I was dealing with a lot of professors. And there was always this complaint saying, you guys don't listen. We are putting all this effort, we are putting all our PhD students, all our research careers and everything, driving this innovation, and companies and standard bodies don't listen, because basically you have tons of investment in networking companies, tons of people in IETF, IEEE, and so on, and they are self-sufficient. So what happened is that we created kind of a bubble that was self-contained. And suddenly the pressure coming from the research community became strong enough that it kind of pierced with new organizations, new models of standard bodies. And that created confusion. I mean, there were some great outcomes out of these discussions and bodies and so on, but at the same time it created conflict and different ways of understanding the world. And this is where we broke kind of a wall where people understood like routing protocols and switching protocols and things like that into a new wall of understanding, from open flows to programmable data planes and things like that. And I don't see them as mutually exclusive. We have to figure out how do we bring back into some forum and start leveraging the innovation that is coming from the research, the innovation that is coming from new ways of thinking into the traditional enterprises, networking companies, and standard bodies. And in here, there is this middle ground, which is the open source. And open source has been kind of the outlet of this innovation. If you think a lot of people with ideas, they are not going to get adoption if nobody productizes it. So open source became an outlet of innovation. And it has this possibility or advantage of becoming a de facto standard. And now we are putting all these investments, all this research in standard bodies, but somehow networking is driven in a much more agile way. It's like, oh, if something happens, something gets injected into Linux, something gets developed and something gets adopted, that becomes a de facto standard. So how do we factor this to the fact that we are trying to transform the way we understand networking towards applications and so on? So that's the other aspect that we have to to figure out how it ties together. So within this, we didn't know where to start. I mean, as you've seen, there's so many topics that we could cover, so many things that we would like to discuss here that we had to pick a few because it's just a day and a half or 2 days conference. And we focus on 4 blocks, but at the same time, don't think that these are the only 4 blocks that we should be discussing here today. So use the time to basically bring up the things that you are working on, the things that you would like to discuss that may not be part of the specific talks, and this is what we have to do in the breakout sessions and the discussions in the corridor. But essentially, one was starting with this intent-based networking. And intent-based networking to me is always like confusing. Every time that there is a new hype term, you say, oh, what does it mean? But well, I'm not going to discuss about that because we are going to have 4 people speaking about the topic that they are much more into the discussions than me. But it's this notion that how do we start figuring out not only how to provision things in a much more efficient, simple, and easy way, but how do we start thinking end-to-end? How do we make sure that we don't fall into our silos of networking and the whole networking end-to-end gets somehow provision? And we are going to talk a little bit about that. Then, just to make sure that we remember that it's not about networking or it's not about infrastructure by itself, that there has to be a business driver on top of it, we are going to have some cloud discussions and some end-user stories about how they are using infrastructure to succeed, how they are using infrastructure and networking to create their own products and solutions. And then tomorrow we are going to shift a little bit more into what's going on in the physical world. I mean, we keep talking about software-defined everything, but I haven't seen a piece of software that runs without hardware. And we always have to be present that the software-hardware ecosystem always is entangled in an interesting way because some software innovation happens, we start consuming too many cycles, it becomes power-hungry, expensive, slow, you name it, depending on what we want to do, and then the hardware moves forward. And then the software innovates, the hardware solves the problem. So this element of interaction between hardware and software, we should not forget about that. It's not that because we say that everything is going to be software-defined, that hardware suddenly is completely relevant. So tomorrow we are going to explore 2 topics on that direction. One is, how do I use the hardware? I mean, it's been used for many years, there's many ways to program it, but now when we start having like 100 gigabits or dual 50s, 100s, and so on and going forward, how am I going to program that? Is it standard programming models? Is it new languages? Is it through kind of Linux? Is it something specialized? So we are going to cover these topics in depth. And at the same time, we are going to explore the role of communities and open source, because programmability has to be tied on how do we create a community, going back to the standard discussion that we were having before, about how these elements are going to create kind of a standardization aspect between all the elements that can be used to accomplish an end-to-end solution. And on the right side, basically, we are going to talk a little bit about the industry of silicon for networking, the adoption in clouds, the adoption of in standard bodies, more the discussion about where the switching industry is going. So with no more delay, I'm going to start introducing Ratul, but essentially just a little bit of logistics before that. We are going to have a talk before lunch. Ratul is going to give us a keynote about the work that he's been doing in Intent and how to configure the network. But we are going to have a break for lunch and we are going to come back together. And after all the discussions of the Intent, we are going to have a panel moderated by Martin. Essentially, the way we have structured it is that we are going to have a group of talks and then hold your questions. We want to make it interactive, but at the same time, we don't want to disrupt the flow. And then after these 3 talks, we are going to have a pause. We are going to bring everybody on stage, and we are going to moderate questions and answers and, with the panelists. Martin is going to come. Martin, probably all of you know him. He was here last year helping on the organization too, and before that in Nicira. So he's going to help us on that. And then we are going to have, in the afternoon, switching the topic towards the cloud users and the end user stories on why infrastructure is relevant. And in here, we are going to insert a talk from Armonto, from HashiCorp, that he's going to explain us how we, after we see the talks on the fundamental changes of infrastructure that you do from a cloud or end user story, how to tie all the pieces together. And he's going to give us a talk that goes like beyond networking and how to stitch all these pieces. And again, we are going to have a question and answer panel on this session. So tomorrow we are going to cover the other topics, but I wanted to introduce Ratul right now. And with no more delay,